do that, I have a great panel. Fahad Al Dubaib, Senior Vice President, Strategy and Market Analysis from Saudi Aramco. Welcome, Fahad. Dr. Samir Saran, President of the Observer Research Foundation based in India, but around the world. Samir, welcome to the session. John Studinsky, Managing Director and Vice Chairman for PIMCO. John, welcome to you. And Chuka Umama, Managing Director, Head of EMA, ESG, and Green Economy Investment Banking in JP Morgan. I hope they pay you double the money for all the work you do, Chuka. All right, okay, let's get into it. So, Fahad, let's start with you. How do you think about energy transition? How is it going right now?
Okay. Good afternoon,
Speak
everyone.
up.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. I think we need to define the energy transition before talking about it. In my mind, energy transition is a process of gradually meeting the increasing energy demand while reducing emissions and without impacting consumers or businesses alike. This is quite important. Because if you look at the energy system today, we have around 325 million barrels of oil equivalent. Oil makes up 100 million, gas 70 million, coal 85 million, and renewables are only 12 million out of that huge system. And since 2015, all forms of energy have been growing, including emissions. So what we have seen is, according to the definition, an energy addition, not an energy transition.
So maybe a quick follow-up. So how do we change that mix? Do you think it's going to happen overnight, or is it a slow process?
I think the pace of the evolution has to look at each country on its own merits. Affordability is a very important factor in the energy transition. And by affordability, we mean, as far as the North is concerned, sustainability is more important than affordability and reliability. However, in the global South, where the levels of income are much lower, affordability, reliability, and then sustainability take precedence. And as we heard today, in an environment where cost of capital is quite high, a lot of these investments that have thin margins will probably have a challenging time succeeding the affordability. The other aspect is demand. If you look at the OECD demand, the energy per capita is 3 times the non-OECD energy per capita. And even within the non-OECDs, if you look at Africa and India, their energy per capita is 1/3 that of China. So you have to look at each one of these countries' evolution with its own energy demand requirements. And if you look at supply, for example, Africa has access to oil and gas, but less coal, and India has coal. So you cannot talk about energy transition without looking at affordability, demand, supply, and the level of economic development in that country. A lot of the countries start economically with agriculture, industrialization before they move to services. And along that trajectory, energy efficiency would gradually evolve and come down.
So what you're describing is what we will call a multi-dimensional transition, right? It's going to be very different in different places. So, good comment.
The other point that people quite often miss is the storage. As we transition from a molecule world to an electron world, storage will be a challenge. Today, we have in the gas system, in Europe, 100 days worth of demand as storage. In the US, 50 days. As far as oil, we have 50 days worth of demand as storage and 35 in the US. In renewable, we have less than 2 hours a day. 2 hours versus days of storage. So that's important from a cost point of view and from managing that transition.
So let's come back to some of the ways we can address that. So Samir, a good segue to you. Let's say you are representing in this panel the global South, not just India. So what does energy transition mean to global South?
I'm just going to build on what Fahad mentioned. For me, this is not necessarily an energy transition. And I think we frame it in a very simplistic manner when we call it that. It is really a materials transition. We are moving from one set of materials to a new set of materials, moving from hydrocarbons to rare earth. And in some ways, the energy density is now more dispersed. And it is going to lead to a whole new ecosystem which will require more movement of material, extraction of material, and of course, dispersion of material to different parts of the world. Let me give you some numbers. I was just preparing for this panel, I chanced upon certain numbers. For example, if we were to look at the demand for materials in the next 35 or 40 years, just for our electric vehicle batteries, there is going to be an 87,000% increase from today. And this is mind-boggling, the kind of materials we need to move to electric mobility. That's the kind of new materials we need. We need 1,000% new materials for wind power, 3,000% increase in materials for solar cells. 1 terawatt of electricity from solar energy could require 400% more material than what we have normally produced using natural gas, coal, or fuel. So we are really going through a material transition. This world is going to be messy. It is going to be more burdensome on the planet. It is going to be geopolitically more complicated because the moving parts are going to be so many, dispersed in so many geographies, that energy politics of the last century would have been a nice breeze. So I think we are going through a material transition. That's the first point. Second point, energy transition is also euphemistically meant to be a clean energy revolution. It is also framed in many parts of the world as moving towards cleaner, greener fuels. Now look, if you are sitting in India and you are using wood and waste to cook food, using gas and hydrocarbons is clean energy transition.
Yes.
And that itself is green transitions, that itself is energy transitions. So I think energy transitions depends on where you stand. For us, moving to formal sources of energy is energy transition. So in many parts of the world, even as we discuss semiconductors and hydrocarbons and lithium and all the rare earths, we are really, for the first time ever, at a moment in history when people are getting formal energy into their homes. From heating to cooking, they're being able to onboard their children to education systems, to digital systems. And I think that itself is the energy transition that I want to discuss. Now, and I think that is lost in the more sexy conversations around ongoing green. I think this is the more real conversation.
So Samir, what you're saying is that actually transition includes both hydrocarbons and renewables.
Absolutely.
So John and Chuka, I'm going to come to the two of you. You are representing the big money, the bankers here. So come to you, John, first. How do you see the world, and particularly the investments in oil and gas have gone up in the recent last couple of years because of higher returns, gone down in the renewables, and how is the industry, in your view, addressing this whole issue?
Thank you. I will make 4 introductory points that address that question. Number one, if you look at the history of energy transition over the last 300 years, it takes much, much longer than anyone ever anticipated, whether we look at coal, oil, gas, or whatever.
Yeah.
But the big theme has always been that it's recently, the transition out has been a much shorter duration. So there's no question this is going to take longer than we'd like, but it is going to be a shorter duration, for example, than the transition to oil. Secondly, if you look around the world, energy transition means different things to different people. I spend my job traveling around the world dealing with large pools of capital, governments around the world. If you're having conversations in Asia, China, Japan, Singapore, Australia, versus Europe, versus North America, South America, Africa, the definition of energy transition is very, very different. It means different things to different people. Yes. And I think we're taking that for granted here. So the clarification of what it means has to be dealt with. Number 3, there has to be political will at the top. And if you look in certain parts of the world, clearly here in Saudi Arabia, there's strong political will. You have strong political will in the Nordic region. You have selective political will in certain states in the United States. And in Asia, it's very varied. You had no political will, I would say, at this point in the global south. And lastly, in terms of flows of capital right now, there isn't enough green or alternative energy investment, even in hydrocarbons and oil, to satisfy the objective. So you really need to look at a transition of brown energies, particularly with hydrocarbon at the center, to green energies, alternative energies, over a 5, 10, 15, 20-year period. And it's that transition, brown to green, that and the discipline of that people really have to focus on.
Yeah, so you're agreeing a little bit, maybe not agreeing with everything. So we'll come back to this question of political will in a minute. But Chuka, coming to you, this whole question of money and investment, and John is saying lack of political will, not enough money flowing. How do you look at the world today?
So, well, first of all, thank you very much for asking me to take part in this and for JP Morgan to be part of this. I think a few points. So, I mean, you refer to us as being the kind of money men, as if you like, or our institutions. And look, Jamie was talking on the stage earlier, of course, but for us, yes, it's a necessity, it poses an existential challenge to society, but it's also a huge opportunity. And so I think for institutions like ours, if you're to do right by your shareholders and above all your clients, then you need to play your part. And talking about quantum, to just give you a sense, we're committed to finance and facilitate $2.5 trillion to deliver against the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including $1 trillion for climate solutions. And that ran from 2021 and goes through to 2030. We've done over $200 billion worth of financing against that target so far. So, of course, we need to do our part, but I think we also have to be realistic and do this in a careful and considered way, because notwithstanding the transition need, we have a wider energy supply need going into the future. We've done research that shows that by 2030, as things currently stand, there will be a 16% delta between the demand for energy and the supply. And that's principally because of population growth in the global south, which of course increases the demand for energy, and that isn't sufficiently offset by the reduction in energy use and emissions in the OECD
efficiency
countries.
And things like that.
So that's absolutely key. Now, when you look at the cost, though, it gets very complex, because there is the cost of us not acting. And if you look at Swiss Re, these people look at it closely, insurers, they are saying if we don't do anything, then it's essentially going to cost us $23 trillion through to 2050, likely to be equivalent to a 14% hit to global GDP. So there's a cost of not acting. And then, of course, there is the different component cost of acting. And, of course, we're mainly focused in discussions around energy and how do we move from fossil fuels and replacing them with alternatives, which in and of itself has a cost. But then you've got power and how we manage power and transforming our grids, energy storage, the software to better manage our energy. And then, of course, then you need to look at industry, the costs of moving to carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, cement and steel in particular, and then the buildings that we live in, and other associated costs. So you need to break those all down. But I actually think one of the hidden costs that we're not talking about is jobs. Because if you look at what's going to happen to jobs, particularly the impact of a move away from fossil fuels and all the people employed there, and McKinsey's done some good research on this, which shows that by 2050, we're going to see 200 million jobs created, but 183, 186 million jobs going.
Yeah.
Now, it's not like that workforce change is going to be perfectly synced. And so there's going to be a huge social cost, which welfare systems are going to have to step in to fill. We're going to need to re-educate, reskill our people, and never mind in developing countries, but if you look in OECD countries, we don't do that well. Technical and vocational education for people having to change careers. So we're going to have to fundamentally transform it. And that's where I think when you look at the global south, there's no hiding away from this issue of how do developed markets help fund the transition in developing markets, which of course is going to be core to COP28.
Yeah, so let me come back to the South question. So Fahad, I know you're eager to respond to the cost question, but also, I mean, the broader issue that what I think I'm hearing is we all agree that we need to invest a lot more in all kinds of energy, not just green energy or brown energy, all of it, and different in the north versus south. But you want to respond?
It's not to respond. I think it's back to framing the issue. The issue is not what form of energy are we using, it's the emissions that we should be addressing. We believe that the energy demand will be growing and you need all forms of energy to address it. At the same time, you need to make the energy system much cleaner. Let me give you an example of the US. In 2007, the share of the energy mix in the US was 23% coal and 23% gas. With the shale gas boom in the US managed to switch a lot of their coal into gas. Today, coal is only 10%, and gas is around 33% of their energy mix. Accordingly, they managed to reduce their emissions by 1.5 gigatons of CO2 over the same period. This is equivalent to the benefits we got from deploying all of the renewables within the US in that year. Instead of just jumping to one form of the energy versus the other, let's focus on emissions, and let's think of what can we do effectively and efficiently to eliminate emissions, whatever the source of energy could be.
So can you very briefly give another example of what maybe Aramco is doing on reducing your emissions?
I think Aramco is focusing on energy efficiency. Demand management is a huge opportunity for countries, for companies to do that. The other things that we're doing is we're investing in renewables. We're building one of the biggest carbon capture hubs globally. It will be on by 2027 in Jubail. It will capture what is equivalent to the emissions of 2 million cars a year. There is huge potential and discussions. It should be focusing on meeting the energy demand and decarbonizing the current energy system and not being, we should be fuel agnostics and technology agnostics.
So Samir, actually there are two things, and if you could be brief on both. One is this question of emissions. We should focus on emissions, but one reality is globally emissions are not going down, although they're going down in US, and they're not going down because the rate of emission in the south is so much higher. And the second thing, I presume you want to respond to the political will, but if you don't, that's fine, or the lack thereof, I think I heard.
No, I think Fahad is right. In the last 30 years, hydrocarbon mix has remained at 80% or 81%. It's really not changed. The energy mix, the share of hydrocarbons. Emissions have increased by 0.9% in 2022. So the fact is emissions have gone up. So despite all the talk since Copenhagen about going green, we are putting more emissions out. And guess what? Those emissions also have a contribution of the developed world who promised in Copenhagen that they are going clean and green. So it's not happened. That's the first. I just want to take something that John said and run with it. Look, I think, John, to say that the global south doesn't have political will is perhaps mischaracterization. There is no leader of the global south who will not want to deliver formal energy to their people. They will not win their election if they don't give food, electricity, fuel, and basic livelihood needs to their people. So I think the single most important agenda of any global south leader is the well-being of his population, because he largely or she largely is going to be put back into office, or the regime is going to sustain on that basis. What you don't see is the grammar and the vocabulary that you are accustomed to in Europe and America. So I think the framing is very different, but the needs are the same. Looking after humans in their regions is absolutely vital to every leader in the global south. That's the first point I want to make. Number two, I think our poverty in the global south cannot be your carbon mitigation strategy. I have said this before. My poverty is not going to underwrite your green transitions. And that is precisely what is happening. Access to formal energy is being made more difficult so that we can underwrite your green transitions. We are paying for your sins, and we obviously have to buy energy at a much higher cost to grow to our aspirational requirements. And I think that is a perverse system. Since we have two folks from the financial sector, I'm not picking on you, I love you both. But since we have two folks from the financial sector, I have only one request. Let's get the bankers to sign on to the Paris Agreement. They have not signed the climate agreement. 75% of all climate finance remains at the country of origin. You mentioned $200 billion. Tell me the statistics, how many of it has moved outside the border? The reality is less than 25% of global climate capital leaves its shores. Now, what does that really mean? It means if 1/3 of all future emissions are going to come out of India in a business as usual scenario, then logically 1/3 of all climate finance must be directed towards India. This is not the case. A percentage of that finance flows to emerging economies. Half of all future emissions are going to come out of it. There is a financial gap here, financing gap here, where big capital is not going to the frontier geographies where we can win the battle.
So Samir, you know, this is a big question which we always talk about, is that if you had the next dollar of money to mitigate emission, where should it go? Should the $390 billion for the IRA in the US better spent somewhere else, because maybe it gets a bigger bang for buck in terms of...
Atul, you triggered me. IRA is hogwash.
Okay.
IRA is muscular nationalist industrial policy. Everything that the US used to come to my country and tell us, don't make industrial policies, don't have controls, don't try to be nationalistic in your economic policies. IRA is precisely make America great again in Biden speak.
Okay, all right. Well, that's maybe another panel discussion about the IRA, but I know the two of you are jumping. Maybe I go to John first and then come to Chuka. So John, I mean, you can address any of the points, but I think the bigger question here is one of leadership. And how do we get leadership, both in the North and the South, to really move the curve, right? And get money also flowing into the South. So please.
Yeah. First of all, I agree with you on the IRA. Let's be clear, it's a strategic industrial policy that suits the United States. And that's what it is. And you're absolutely right. And if you think it's anything else, you're absolutely nuts. The reality is the global South is at a totally different phase of development. They can't even talk about energy transition because, as you say that rightly, they're at another level of needs. So the types of infrastructure you need there, and we're talking about basic infrastructure, that type of investment is what Shamira was talking about in the last panel. Those types of investments produce generally, on average, a return of 4 to 8% at the most, probably closer to 4 or 5% returns. So the types of capital that are focusing on that on a risk-adjusted basis, fairly limited. When you talk about energy transition in the developed world, in the G20, what we're lacking globally right now, and this is where I think Aramco can play an extraordinary role going forward at COP28 and going forward at the next FII, is playing a much global leadership role, because the whole area of energy transition does not have a spokesperson. There's no one out there who every day, people talk about climate, but they need to be more granular. They need to talk about energy transition as a strategy that has capital that needs to be deployed. And when I look at capital being deployed, the financial markets, people like us, we need more guidance because there isn't enough framework of opportunities. As a matter of fact, when I look at the opportunities versus the capital, it's very small. And that's where the term greenwashing came from originally, because there were so few opportunities that people regarded it as ticking a box and symbolic, but not really reflecting investing in reducing carbon emissions. And I think that's the most important thing. There has to be a global spokesperson, global leadership, and it has to be someone who can cross many boundaries and has the financial resources to do that. And I think Aramco is in a very strong position to provide that leadership.
So I do have follow-up, but I know you've been wanting to respond to us, so please go ahead.
Well, there's so much to unpick in what Samir said. So look, the first thing is just in relation to this argument that, let me put it crudely, how dare you in OECD countries lecture us in the global south about the need to transition when you've already used up the world's carbon budget. And I think this is why, I've said that those who, for example, criticize the fact that COP28 is taking place in an oil-producing nation and has a president associated with the oil industry really need to take a step back and think about how their critique sounds, particularly coming from the mouths of people in those OECD countries. And they may also wish to reflect, by the way, these the critics on the fact that, I mean, if you've got an issue with COP being hosted in an oil-producing nation in the UAE, well, the UN is headquartered in the biggest oil-producing nation on the planet, and no one ever said that was a problem. So I hear what you're saying, is the first point. Secondly, on the question that you asked at the start about whether there is a political will or not to act on these things, I think the challenge is, particularly in countries with democratic systems, I'm a former member of the UK Parliament, is that because of the election cycle, which is anything usually between 3 and 5 years, people tend to look very much to the short term. What does drive sentiment to some extent, but I don't think we can rely on this because otherwise we are heading for disaster, is where you have had an extreme weather event driven by climate change. That has definitely impacted elections. So if you look at the federal election in Germany in October 21, or in Australia following the wildfires, there was a move towards parties that were arguing for green solutions. And the third point is, I mean, look, there's an issue for the Global South, but frankly, there's an issue worldwide on getting capital to the kind of growth equity, new green economy companies that are developing the technologies which ultimately will help us avoid a catastrophe. And the challenge is this, is that if you look at where VC and private equity capital has been going since the beginning of 2021, when it's been going into the green economy, a third of it, roughly, is going to low carbon energy and renewables, and about 40% is going to e-mobility, so battery, EV, anything associated. And when I look at, the equity private placements that we do out of the investment banking business at JP Morgan, our business matches the overall picture. Now, of course, that is just going to part of the emissions that were being talked about, because if you look at the sustainable food ecosystem or the needs of industry to operate on a more low carbon emission basis, there isn't sufficient capital going to that. And really the heart of the problem here is, I mean, people often compare the green industrial revolution to the tech revolution and kind of scribe on the tech forms of financing to climate investing. And that doesn't really work, because with green economy companies, they're operating in a space where you need a lot more upfront investment. They are more capital intensive and asset heavy, whereas the VC model is more for asset light, less capital intensive businesses. Now, you could say, okay, well, maybe you need more of an infra style form of financing, but they're not quite that kind of capital intensive and a kind of heavy asset base. And what we do need to do is grow a form of financing in the middle. And this is where, and I think you touched on it, we have got to, in the markets, come up with a definition of what we see as a transition asset. Because that's where I think you can make the most difference. Part of the problem with greenwashing is people are trying to paint a brown to green story as a green story when it isn't. We need to grow a new asset class, and in order to do that, we have to agree on a definition.
So, Chirka, I mean, a lot of things. John, very quick comment, because I do want to get a question from the audience. Yeah.
But I do think the whole brown to green framework, which is I alluded to and you've alluded to, is something people have to start thinking about, because that's where the type of leadership and the partnership that you need from the Global South. And I think also from a political will point of view, it's a lot easier for governments in democracies which don't necessarily have a 5 or 10 year projection. In a brown to green strategy, you can create something that everybody will be willing to partner with. If you're looking at pure green, people are not prepared to take that type of risk or that type of abrupt transition.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are so many things we can talk about. Unfortunately, we have a very limited time. But I'm going to give the audience maybe a couple of questions, and then we will have, and if you want to direct it to somebody in particular, I have a long list here. Okay, gentlemen, since you are in the right place, I can see you. Please say who you are, and then a brief question, not a statement.
I'll try. My name is Amancio Torres. I'm Portuguese, but I live in Riyadh for a long time, okay? So my question is, in your models, in financial models, the investment to support the transition of energy, do you also include the cost that or the investment that you need to put in place to tackle the social impact of that transition?
Okay, so great question. One more question. All right, there, the lady here. So that question really probably for the two of you.
Thank you, Atul. Noura Mansouri from Capsarc. My question is to the gentleman from the banks. Yes. So how do we deal with the shrinking available funds for development, especially for developing countries, in an increasingly ESG-centered regulations on funding?
So let's do this. Maybe John, you answer that question. And Chuka, you answer, because you would also look at ESG, and the point is ESG preventing money from coming in? Then we may have time for one more question, maybe to these two gentlemen. So John, why don't we start with the question?
Very good question. We've been working at PIMCO for the last 15 years researching E, S, and G, and we score fixed income instruments, bonds, with E scores, S scores, and G scores. And stakeholders increasingly, as they look at investments and they look at companies, people aren't really looking at green companies because there aren't enough pure green opportunities. But when they're talking about big pension portfolios, and see, I'm talking about trillions of dollars here around the world that drive people's pensions, which is a big portion of the world economy and investment capital. Those people look at E and S, and they're now, it's interesting, everybody understands E. E has become very well defined in people's vocabulary and definition in terms of investing. They don't understand S. I was interested to hear Jane Fraser introduce S as also meaning security. But S is now, in terms of energy transition, very much something that stakeholders, employees, customers, and governments are taking into account when they're talking about the cost of energy transition.
Okay, Shaka, very brief because we're running out of time.
All right.
Question.
Yeah, really brief. The social cost essentially is primarily an issue for governments. I don't think it's our job as banks to, if you like, fund welfare systems and pay for the education and skills that will be needed to retrain people, is the first point. I think the second point is, let's be clear what we're talking about. When you're talking about ESG investing, that's quite different from investing with a purpose of sustainability, right? So the investors I speak to, they use ESG as a proxy for prudent risk management, frankly. And if you look at most ESG integration strategies, they're focused on how does the C-suite's ability to manage these issues promote financial performance. So that should not necessarily stand in the way of investors investing in the transition, whether it's in the global south or the north. And the final thing is, I do think in terms of addressing the issue that John was talking about, in terms there being a lack of bankable and investable projects, particularly in the global south, I do think the World Bank, and it was good to hear what Ajay was saying this morning, could play a much bigger role. So I think, it could more efficiently and aggressively use its balance sheet without threatening its AAA rating. And I think there's also a case for perhaps not only seeing what the World Bank does in terms of providing finance, because there's advisory and knowledge it can bring to the table when it's not providing finance, which would enable private capital to better identify those investable projects, because they've got people on the ground who can do the due diligence, who know the projects that have the right risk-return profile. And just because they might not be putting finance into a particular project should not preclude them bringing their expertise to the table, which is quite unique.
So, Chuka, good, there's a good sort of hope for the future here, particularly with what Ajay said this morning. Very brief with Samir, and then you get the last word.
I just wanted to conclude by kind of summing up my takeaway.
Yeah.
There are two transitions. One is the transition from no energy to formal energy. So from zero energy to formal energy, the other is from brown to green. There are two transitions happening simultaneously, and I don't think there is a political case yet that I have heard which says that a low carbon transition is a public good. I think any energy transition is the larger public good, and therefore technologies that capture carbon and that allow a much wider basket of energy to be deployed for the benefit of humankind is a more sustainable model that I see. So carbon capture and choose your emissions, don't choose your fuels. I think choosing the fuels, you're fixing and rigging the marketplace. You have to allow the marketplace to determine the best models for the future.
Okay. Fahad.
Before my concluding comment, I'd like to talk about the cost of the what's being captured. To finance projects, yes, the financial models capture this, but not all of these projects have economical returns, and this is where the government support might not be captured in this. The other cost that's hidden is what we saw in the summer of 2022, when the world lost 7% of its gas supply, prices went sevenfold, coal production went to record, emissions went to record, industrial production was impacted. All of these costs are not managed or addressed in all of that evaluation and financial models. I think the point I want to make is this is a global problem and requires global solution. And global solutions come from every stakeholder. Energy companies, renewable companies, financial institutions, consumers, government. You cannot address it with one stakeholder or the other. It requires everyone. And we're excited that this COP and the previous COP, finally oil and gas companies are part of that dialogue, because we are part of that solution and we will make a difference.
So that's a very good place to end. As they say, it takes a village, so it's going to take even a bigger village. And I do want to highlight one point, Chirka, you made, that we are seeing the impact of climate change. So we just have to, and the worst situation is the poorest countries are seeing the biggest impact. So it has to be addressed, and there is a strong willingness to address more leadership and more money. So with that, please join me in thanking this great panel. Thank you.